Hello, my dear children. How are you? Today we are going to be talking about the clashing values of the 1920s, and there's a handout that goes with it, and it's at the copier, so I can't show it to you. But anyway, it's the page number you need to know is posted on Remind, but it has kind of 4 quadrants, and it says old ideas, new ideas related to several topics. Okay. So I'm starting with this graphic that is trying to show you a big idea about the 1920s and our culture. And that, as you can see, around 1920, that the number of people who lived in cities actually starts to exceed the number of people who lived in the rural areas. And so what we're going to see are real like clashes between the old, more traditional way of living and the new, more urban, modern way of living. And so we're going to explore just a couple different ways in which that is true. Let's start with the role of women. This is fascinating, actually. My grandmother very much grew up in the old way of living, and she grew up on a subsistence farm in rural America. She was born in 1913, so by the time the 30s were around, she was a teenager. And the way that this worked is that females never were allowed to be in the company of men they were not related to without a chaperone. Because there was this sense that if a girl was alone with a male, they might commit some sexual act that would mean that she was impure and therefore unworthy of marriage from that point forward. So if you wanted your daughter to be able to get married later, she needed to have a good reputation. This is all part of that double standard whereby women are held to different standards of purity and morality than men. So unchaperoned casual dating never happened in rural areas. Also, women dressed conservatively, and they very much were conformed to the authority of their parents or the patriarchal structure that existed in the time. So rural areas are very much the last ones to change. It's understood that women are conforming to the cult of domesticity, which is the idea that they have household duties. They don't really attend to a lot related to public life, particularly if it doesn't have to do with the church or with children. It was understood that middle-class women would give up their jobs once they got married and would not work outside the home once they were married and had children. And the double standards still exist in all the ways I just talked about in terms of women being expected to be more moral and pure, not cuss, not drink, not smoke, not go on unchaperoned dates. This starts to change in the cities. The first thing is with clothing. During World War I, it became very expensive to make clothes using lots of fabric. And a dress in the Victorian style with the high collar and the long sleeves down to the ankles, that usually took about 9 yards of fabric to make. And as fabric became more and more expensive during wartime demand going up, then they decided that perhaps they could make new fashions that didn't take as many yards of fabric. So women started dressing with not high necks, not long dresses, not long sleeves, just conserving fabric. And really a flapper dress was only 1 or 2 yards of fabric, which was quite a crazy change. Also, women in the city started having jobs, and therefore they had their own money, which meant that they could spend it as they wished. And if they chose to buy cigarettes or they chose to buy alcohol, which was illegal but available, then it was very little people could do to stop them. So the idea of women working and having their own money was quite revolutionary. Also, women had been given the right to vote, and so in the cities, they tended to exercise that right, get involved in politics, begin having their own opinions about ideas and areas outside of the home. And in general, they just had changes in their attitudes and norms. They began casually dating and drinking alcohol and using curse words perhaps, and cutting their hair and wearing makeup. All of these were changes for women in modern areas that began to be quite common and also pretty radical to people who lived in the countrysides. So here's some example of some modern women wearing shorter dresses, sleeveless dresses, shorter hair, makeup, and having some fun out on the town. That would be an example of the urban new woman. All right, African Americans have a lot of changes that affect them when they move to the cities as well. If you remember, during World War I, the Great Migration encouraged a lot of African Americans to move up into the northern cities, where segregation was not by law, but rather by custom, called de facto segregation instead of de jure. So old ideas related to African Americans were efforts to keep them from voting, like the literacy test and the poll tax. Of course, the lack of respect and the racial etiquette that affected African Americans that we talked about when we talked about lynching and the growth of Jim Crow. Segregation was common in the South by law. In the North, it was still common by custom. And of course, anybody who broke racial etiquette or in some way behaved in a way that did not meet the expectations of whites, they could always face the threat of being lynched. Though that happened a lot more in the South than in the North. So in the North, and during this time period in the 1920s, we have some new opportunities for African Americans. They moved into factory work in the cities during World War I and benefited from better pay and greater freedom related to wage labor. And they founded their own organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is going to use the courts mainly to start challenging the discrimination and segregation in the country. So that gave them a sense of pride and purpose. We also, I said, the Great Migration, which is the whole movement of African Americans from the South to the North. And then they had an explosion of cultural contributions as a result of this. A lot of African Americans came together in the cities, and they had an explosion of poetry, music, drama, writing, all kinds of expression that allowed them to better communicate with one another. What their feelings were, and also exercise their considerable talents and demonstrate them to the world. So some examples of famous Harlem Renaissance contributions was, for example, Langston Hughes. You might remember him from English class, where he was our most famous Harlem Renaissance poet who emphasized a lot of new themes related to the Black experience. And then we had Louis Armstrong, who's a famous trumpeter and singer of the jazz tradition, and that's going to be the first uniquely American music to develop in America, and it uses improvisation and playfulness with lyrics and multiple instruments that have a call and response aspect to them. So very innovative, new type of music that was demonstrated best by people like Louis Armstrong, also Bessie Smith, who was a vocalist, who was a female vocalist who sang in jazz clubs, and Duke Ellington, who is a composer and kind of a producer of jazz music, and will also help with the development of a smoother form of jazz that gets into the 30s called swing, but he was known as Duke Ellington. Okay, so this is an example of the most famous jazz joint. It was in Harlem, and it was called the Cotton Club. It was kind of an interesting club because all the patrons were white, but all the servants and the entertainers were Black. Remember that Black and white people are not allowed to sit together socially in public areas during this time period. So the Cotton Club was a way in which Black artists entertained and made money from white patrons in the Harlem Renaissance. Famous writers include Countee Cullen, and there's a picture of Langston Hughes. I talked about him earlier. There's Bessie Smith, there's Louis Armstrong. So those are the people we just spoke about. Give you a visual image to go with them. All right, Prohibition. The old idea about alcohol was that alcohol is a moral problem, and it's the root of social problems, and it needs to be rooted out of the social fabric of the country. The new norm in the cities was that alcohol is just kind of a social lubricant. It's kind of part of city life. It helps people have fun and be conversant and casual in their conversation. And the 18th Amendment had been created in the old tradition, and it banned alcohol in the whole country. You could not sell, transport, or consume alcohol after the 18th Amendment was created. However, this bumps up against the realities in the cities of this new attitude related to alcohol. So what happens is they make this amendment, but they do not up the forces that will enforce this law. There's no increase in resources or budgets to actually enforce prohibition. So what happens is that we just have kind of a flagrant flouting of the law. Speakeasies are secret bars where you can go and knock on the door, and somebody will ask you for the passcode, and you can tell them the code and they'll let you in. And then there's bootleggers who smuggle illegal alcohol, sometimes in their boots and flasks. And we get the whole rise of gang culture and organized crime. And it's mainly that they run illegal alcohol, gambling, sometimes prostitution later on in their development. But the birth of gangs in America after political machines was now these alcohol-related bootlegging operations. The most famous one was Al Capone of Chicago, the gangster, the Godfather in Chicago. This is a picture of a raid that they did. They dressed up as police officers and they raided their competition's warehouse, and this was called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where they shot down Bugsy Malone and all of his men. They were always fighting over territory, who was going to sell alcohol where. It's like a street-to-street fight sometimes for who was going to control the bootlegging operations. And this is an example of a speakeasy and a jazz club. All right, the next big thing is there's a battle between traditional religion and new ideas related to religion, which are more connected to science. All right, the old ideas related to religion is that there were mainstream Christian ideas that we should teach creation as it is presented in Genesis in the Bible. So the earth was created in 7 days, Adam and Eve, God created all of this, that the earth was about 4,000 to 5,000 years old and no older. The problem is that it's about this time period that we start pulling these huge bones out of the ground that are clearly related to animals like no one has ever seen before in all of human history, and they seem to be dinosaurs. They also start to read about Charles Darwin's theories related to evolution, and he starts to show how perhaps that the evolutionary cycle has led to greater and greater changes over time of different species, and that they might have been changing for millions of years, not 5,000 years. So suddenly the whole fabric underneath our religious worldview starts to come under some challenge, and this leads to considerable stress and frustration between these two groups in the culture. There's a teacher named John Scopes. He's a biology teacher in a classroom in Tennessee, and he knows that it's against the law for him to teach about evolution, but he does it anyway. He's being civilly disobedient in 1925. This leads to this huge trial that gets worldwide attention. It's called the Monkey Trial, where everyone who had something to say or think about this descended upon this one town, Dayton, Ohio, to hold this kind of interesting trial. Now, what was interesting about the trial is it's clear that Scopes is guilty. He says he taught evolution. He knew it was against the law. This is kind of a no-brainer. Instead, the whole thing takes on a whole new theatrical quality because there's the preeminent lawyer of the country, Clarence Darrow, who decides he's going to defend evolution, and a politician we've talked about before, William Jennings Bryan, who is a fundamentalist who believes in a literal interpretation of the Bible. And this trial really becomes just a way for them to argue each other in public about their respective views. Scopes is found guilty and he's fined, and then later they waive the fine because of a technicality. But it was never really about that. It was really about two of the greatest intellectual minds squaring off in this trial. And at some point, Clarence Darrow actually brings William Jennings Bryan onto the stand and has him defend the Bible under oath, which is pretty interesting. So it's interesting times for sure. This is the two men who were actually friends, even though they engaged in this intellectual debate. And this is John Scopes, the teacher who taught evolution in Tennessee. This is the Anti-Evolution League that was set up, and this is some clips from the actual trial in Dayton. Okay, and that is it. Whew, just another time. What you need to know about the clashing values of this time period between urban and rural America. Okay, see you in class.